first off, 10 years to midnight. Explain the title of the book. Where did you get the title of the book from?
Well, we didn't really want to write that title. The book kind of forced us to, right? So
Yeah.
what we discovered is that when we unpack the crises that are at the heart of the book, every one of them has the same pattern, which is there's something going on that's systemic. It's got a lot of components that are causing it. Therefore, it's hard to change.
Yeah.
It's bad this year, it's worse next year, and about a decade from now, it goes really, really dark unless we do something about it. And so the challenge is that in the 4 crises, each of them is really hard to change, and we have a decade to change them. And so it's a pretty serious set of questions.
You, in the book, and your team came up with the adage, adapt. I just wondered for the listeners or for the viewers, if you could just unpack what adapt actually means.
So we started this by trying to find out what people were worried about, right? And so we did interviews in about 60 countries, in government, in the private sector, in civil society, and we just talked in coffee shops and taxi drivers, right? And try to get people who are just trying to live a regular life. And what we discovered was the same 5 worries were pervasive around the world at all levels, from government to corporate boards to dinner table, right? And that never happens to get that consistency unless you have something like a pandemic like we just had, right? So we said, let's figure out what that is, and we dug a little deeper. And adapt simply summarizes those 5 words. So it is asymmetry, meaning disparity across regions, across individuals, and across generations in wealth. Disruption is the unintended consequences of technology on society and our lives. I'll leave age. P is for polarization, sort of the fracturing of the global accord and polarization within society, people at each other's throats and at odds with one another. T stands for trust. It's probably better thought of distrust, so to distrust in institutions and leaders. And the A, the middle A in adapt, is for age. And so in some parts of the world, they're getting much, much older and putting pressure on the system because of people nearing retirement. And others, they're very young, but entering the workforce and putting massive pressure on the system to solve education and create work. And so it's just a simple acronym to remember those 5 worries that the world has.
Now, when we were talking previously, you were saying that you didn't go looking for this. You were literally just going out to do a research, to listen. You weren't looking to kind of write this very stark book.
No, I mean, you realize that PwC doesn't use the word crisis happily, right? I mean, we're a conservative, quite reticent organization, and I'm one of the world's biggest optimists personally. So I don't write a book that says 10 years to midnight happily, right? But the data found us. We didn't find it, right? We weren't looking for it. And what we did, so after we did this work on the worries, we said that because of the consistency, let's discover them. So we went to 14 countries and we dug really deeply into the data. And what we saw was these 4 things just popped out at you, and they have the characteristic I described earlier, right? And the problem is they're really hard to change, and we have 10 years. That if we don't sort of blare a clarion call, get on this, people, we're just being irresponsible, right? And so it was the data that suggested that we were simply trying to find information to adapt our strategy, right? It was an internal effort to see what do we do as PwC to be more resilient and forward-looking, and then we saw it and said, no, this is big. We have to start writing about this and talking about it.
Before we get into the 5 crises, the adapt, you in the book talk about massive and fast. You talk about kind of 2 areas that we have to address more quicker than any other. Could you tell the viewers about that a bit? I mean, we were talking about the huge amount of jobs that are going to go to AI, and then we're also talking about climate change. But just unpack it a little bit more for us.
So there's sort of these 2 classes of solution we propose, right? One of them is actually act on the system and work the system. The problem is that's going to take a while to have an effect. Many of the issues we have to address, we can work that way, but there are 2 we can't wait. So climate, let's do climate for a minute and show the structure of the crisis. So take the forest fires in Southeast Asia, Australia, California, Brazil, right? They were bad last year. worse this year, then get worse next year. Eventually, the fires will be bad enough that the ecosystem can't replenish. You pair that with the coral in the South China Sea and around Indonesia and around Australia. They're dying at an accelerated rate. Bad that last year, worse this year, worse next year. Within a decade, we'll have lost much of the world's lungs. The problem is, at the same time, don't you? I grew up in Canada and Russia. Their northern hemisphere, their northern climate is hot, much hotter for much longer, and so the peat moss is thawing. Turns out the tundra will release massive amounts of methane into the atmosphere. Methane is 10 to 30 times more efficient. So here's the issue, right? We're losing the lungs, the Earth's capacity to pull CO2 equivalents out of the atmosphere at a time when we're putting a way more efficient gas into the atmosphere. That becomes a cycle that's hard to break into. So the argument is, look, if we do not solve this problem in the next 10 years, it will be virtually impossible to solve. And we're talking about human existence here. You know, we're not talking about the economy being worse off. We're not talking about, we're not talking about a lot of people, hundreds of thousands of people have done. We're talking about human existence. And so could we please get on with it, right? And so we have to get really massive, really fast, because it's everywhere in the world and it's everything we do, right? So it's how we grow and it's how we farm and how we process food and save food. It's how we transport. It's our energy system. It's our manufacturing system. It's our building system. And so we have to change the whole way in which we manage our kind of industrial system and our lifestyle. So massive and fast. Then the other one is the AI and concentration of wealth due to technology and the loss of work that's going to come from some of the other circumstances. We think that kind of the only answer to that is massive growth in small business all over the world. Right. So it's a guy we describe in India who says they need 10 million successful new businesses in a decade. That's an astronomically large number.
Yeah.
Right.
You say in the book that sort of shareholder value and profit has accelerated on one line, but then sort of social benefit has accelerated, or if on a much slower line.
Yeah.
And they used to be interlinked and they are no longer interlinked, and where a lot of people are being left behind. Could you unpack that a little more for us?
We have two simple measures, GDP and shareholder value, right? And as presently measured, they don't serve us well, right? So if you think about globalization and technology and put them together, what happened with the two of those working in tandem is we concentrated wealth massively. Right, and simple way to think about that is two phenomenon that in transparent world where you have kind of global movement of money or labor or work, small differences matter, and when you take network effects and scale and scope effects, it builds it. So, for example, Apple traded at the FTSE 100 plus $500 billion 2 weeks ago, right? That's massive concentration of wealth. To kind of fix that, and we didn't see it. The reason we didn't see it is that because we were looking at GDP, we said the economy is doing great. Mm-hmm. So the US economy was doing great, UK economy was doing great, Chinese economy was doing great, but we missed the fact that wealth was concentrating in a few places and everyone else was being left behind. So you need subtler, more inclusive measures. If we had GDP and we looked at dispersion of wealth and we looked at dispersion of income and we looked at measures of inclusiveness and we looked at kind of measures of interdependence, which is how much are you drawing on the social good in order to create your wealth, right? So, for example, we don't really incorporate the forward-looking cost of environment into the rental costs in property when you drill a well, right? Mm-hmm. So let's look at interdependence and inclusiveness, but not have so many, because the problem, in a sense, think about the UN development goals, there's so many, it's hard to achieve. When you go after all of them, you get none of them, right? So appropriate level of concentration, but not one measure. Shareholder value, same thing, is shareholder value was essentially sort of forward-looking profit with a discounted cash flow, right? We probably ought to include other things that relate to value. So today, for example, if a company that has massive climate risk is not incorporating that into its forward-looking value, shareholders eventually will lose.
Yeah.
So be more inclusive, right? Don't throw it out. Just be more sophisticated in the way we think about the measure.
For a while, it looked like globalization was working really well for everybody.
Right. Yeah.
But in fact, what's happened is now we have these people who have left behind that then create the big pockets of polarization that lead to results such as Trump winning the election or Brexit, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So if you think about it, you have to go back to, there were two major phenomena that we were trying to fix over the last 7 years. One of them is the massive destruction of the Second World War. So what we needed was economic growth, period. That's all we needed. Who cared about how inclusive it was? Who cared about whether companies had sophisticated measures of value? Generate profit, generate growth, right? And then we included India and China and other economies into the global economy. And there what we're trying to do is bring people out of poverty. So sure, maybe you hurt the middle class in the Midlands of England, but Jesus, we brought 2 billion people out of poverty. The trade-off is pretty straightforward. The problem is that as you become successful with those two kind of deep problems, you have a different issue now, which is in the process of adding technology to globalization, we concentrated wealth. And so we essentially began to erode the middle class. Now, here's the problem with that one, right? Which is as you erode the middle class, essentially the economy eventually eats its tail because you have no customer, right? And so even for the wealthy person, if you stay long enough, it becomes your problem because you have no one to sell to, right? Except yourself, right? And so, but that's a second order problem. Let's get poverty taken care of. Let's rebuild from the Second World War. And so I would never go back and change what we did for 70 years, but we now have a new class of problem and they're just as dangerous. It turns out two of them, I think, are existential, right? And so they're more urgent, I think, even than after the Second World War. So, but we needed a new answer for a new world, basically.
So can we talk about how tax systems need to be re-looked at or rethought? Because nobody likes paying taxes, even though they are one of the two certainties in life.
Well, we need taxes because we need government to do what government has to do for us, right? And so we can't avoid the need to create fiscal capability in our governments. The challenge is that our tax system was based on a world where we had an income-based, middle-class driven society. We now have essentially a wealth-based, increasingly disparate society. And so just think about it for a minute. If you're, imagine just for fun, you were worth $10 billion. Just try that for fun.
I'm laughing, so I imagine that would be fun.
So if you had that, how much of that do you think would translate into income in any 1 year? A small fraction, right? Okay, because you can't spend it. So you're going to keep it as wealth. Therefore, you're not going to really capture the wealth with an income tax, right? Imagine how much of that could you spend? Now, if you're really silly, you could blow it, but the average billionaire didn't become a billionaire by knowing how to throw it away, right? They actually got there by knowing how to save their pennies, right? Or whatever your favorite currency is they're saving. And so they're not going to spend it. Therefore, that's not going to get it, right? And they're not going to spend the same amount of their wealth on a house as the average person does. And so the average person is spending huge amounts of their income on their house, usually 2 to 3 times their income, and their general wealth. They're actually taking a lot of their wealth and using it to consume, which is where that gets them. And actually they're taking it as income. They're not growing wealth, right? So we are disproportionately harming the working person who has a moderate income. That's crazy.
It almost sounds medieval.
It was a good system for the 20th century. We're in the 21st century. We need a new system. And we have to be careful. What we can't do is scare wealth away from a country, right? Because it's easy to move. You got to be smart about what you do, but you have to have a system that more effectively, more fairly taxes, basically. And it's going to take some really smart brains to come up with that one. But the present system, because of the way wealth is moving today, is in some ways just not meeting the need. And what you see is in many countries, the amount of tax actually being being accrued as a result of any unit growth of GDP is declining every year, year on year, which is evidence that actually we're not tapping where the real money is. And all the wealthy people I know believe they should pay their fair share. Now, there are always individuals who don't want to pay their fair share across all levels of society, but most people want to pay their fair share. They just want it to be a fair and even tax system. They don't want it to be imbalanced or unfair. So we need to be really thoughtful about what we do and just change the system to go after where money is.
Well, you just described yourself as one of the world's biggest optimists. Is that how you can actually come to write a book like this? Because we were talking before, I said this was one of the books that scared me the most since Stephen King's It when I was a child. I mean, like, how do you collate all this terrifying information and yet sleep at nights?
Well, I mean, I have sort of faith in humanity when we recognize the problem. I think when we get in trouble is when we deny, right? So when we put our heads in the sand and be an ostrich. But history shows that when we recognize a problem, we get on it, right? The issue for me is if it got too far, it's really hard to come back. And so to me, if I'm an optimist, I've got to get the story out so that people see it and we do something about it. And you're already seeing motion on all the crises, right? In a way that's kind of positive. The worry for me is we're in a race and I'm afraid we might lose the race. And so we're trying to accelerate the speed at which we do these things, really, in some ways. But I, the other thing that's important in that, by the way, is the world we have, if we address these crises, is unbelievably spectacular. It really is kind of a fork in the road. I also hate that analogy, by the way. I hate the first fork in the road, but we're at one, because it goes really, really dark or it goes really, really light, and it depends on what we choose to do over the next 10 years. Right. And
I mean, I think we spoke last time, didn't we? And I asked you, is this, what percentage of the book is a stark warning and what percentage of the book is it a message of hope?
Well, it's a sort of, I've been describing it as a play to people lately, right? Which is the first act sets up a really terrible problem and the second act hopefully reconciles it. And so the first act is actually a horror story. I mean, and it really is in some ways a very scary circumstance, but we can do something about it. The thing I want to highlight is the reason for 10 years. If we start working on it now, we have time. Every year we wait, it gets that much harder to solve.